It's 1944, and World War II is in full swing. The skies once again become the battlefield, and planes clash in breathtaking combat. Among American pilots, anticipation and preparation for encounters with the Japanese Air Force were constant. But what they weren't ready for was a machine with such unexpected characteristics that it left even the most experienced pilots scratching their heads. I'm talking about Kawanishi H8K, a Japanese bomber that, amid the aerial chaos of the war, made its entrance in an unconventional way. Known as the Flying Duck by Allied pilots, the H8 kit was unlike anything they had ever seen before. With a peculiar design, its enormous wings, robust fuselage, and twin tails stood out on the horizon. Its appearance was enough to make many wonder if they were looking at an aircraft or a piece of experimental Japanese engineering. And indeed, the H8 kit was a masterpiece that surprised even the most experienced pilots. Now, imagine the surprise of the American aviators when they came across such an imposing, unique plane in the middle of a war already full of challenges. Kawanishi H8K was there to change the game, and the American pilots would be left with the impression that they were facing something completely new and, perhaps, even more dangerous than they thought. The Kawanishi H8 kit was designed to be a long-range bomber capable of flying missions over great distances in the Pacific theater of war. What most surprised American pilots, besides its unusual shape, was its effectiveness. H8K was much more than an exotic-looking aircraft. It was a highly functional war machine. Its configuration was radically different from the aircraft the Allies were accustomed to facing, which gave it a significant strategic advantage. Its robust fuselage and wide, high wings allowed it to support considerable weight, as well as providing a large payload capacity, essential for carrying a large number of high-impact bombs. But the most impressive thing about Kawanishi H8K was its range and speed. It could cover great distances without being easily intercepted, which gave Japan an advantage, especially on night bombing missions, when the Allies were most vulnerable. Another aspect that caught the attention of American pilots was its aerodynamics. The fuselage, though wide, was perfectly adapted to withstand the rigors of long flights, while the two tails provided greater stability during flight. This peculiar design, which led the Allies to refer to the plane as a duck, also gave it impact resistance. Its construction was solid enough to withstand damage, which further increased the frustration of Allied pilots when trying to bring it down. The Kawanishi H8 kit was designed to operate strategically, and its primary mission was to conduct long-range bombing raids. With its incredible range, it was one of Japan's most effective long-range weapons during World War II. When it entered service, H8 became a considerable challenge for American pilots, who were used to facing planes with more conventional characteristics. These bombers were used primarily for long-range missions, especially attacking islands and military bases in the Pacific where American pilots were based. What most surprised the Allied pilots was how the H8K moved through the sky. Although its appearance was somewhat clumsy, its speed and maneuverability were impressive, and it frequently evaded American interception attempts. For bombers venturing on high-altitude attacks, the H8K was a formidable adversary, capable of carrying out aerial raids with efficiency and precision. During these missions, many American pilots reported a sense of bewilderment upon seeing the Japanese bomber streaking across the sky. Many pilots' first reaction was one of utter surprise. The H8 kit looked more like a cargo plane than a fighter bomber, confusing the Allies about its true nature. Some American pilots even thought Japan had created a new type of experimental aircraft, something beyond anything they had encountered before. This surprise was not limited to the plane's appearance, but also to its endurance. The Kawanishi H8 kit was difficult to shoot down, and many American pilots reported difficulty shooting it down during raids. Furthermore, it possessed an impressive bombing capability, making it a constant threat in the Pacific. As the war progressed, American pilots faced unexpected challenges as they faced the Kawanishi H8 kit. Wasn't just its exotic appearance and impressive range that made it difficult to defeat. It was also the Japanese bomber's resilience and agility in the sky. Unlike many large bombers of the time, the H8 combined surprising speed with remarkable resistance to damage, making it a formidable opponent for the Allied forces. The first difficulty the American pilots faced when trying to bring down the H8 was its ability to fly at high altitudes, which made interception difficult. Many Allied bombers were configured to operate at lower altitudes, which gave the H-8K an advantage in terms of maneuverability and difficulty of engagement. When American pilots tried to attack, the H-8K often managed to escape because of its efficient aerodynamics and the speed at which it could move. Furthermore, the H-8 kit was armed with machine gun turrets, which increased its protection and made attempts to shoot it down even more difficult. During encounters in the sky, many American pilots found themselves having to perform complex evasive maneuvers to avoid enemy fire. The Japanese bomber not only withstood the impact well, but could also return fire accurately, forcing American pilots to be more careful and strategic in their attacks. The Kawanishi H8 kit also stood out for its ability to carry out precise bombing runs at long range. Even when American pilots managed to engage the bomber in combat, it often had already dropped its bombs, causing significant damage to American bases and fleets before attempting to escape. The challenge for the Allied pilots was clear. The H-8 wasn't just a flying duck. It was a war machine adapted to withstand the challenges posed by the conflict in the Pacific. Its presence in the sky posed a constant threat that demanded not only aerial combat skills but also strategic adaptation from Allied pilots. As the presence of the Kawanishi H8K the storm intensified over the Pacific, American pilots realized that their usual tactics would not be sufficient to deal with this new challenge. Initial surprise was replaced by an urgent need to adapt. The Japanese flying duck, with its endurance and ability to launch long-range attacks, demanded a more sophisticated and strategic response from the Allied forces. The Americans began to adapt their aerial combat tactics to face the H-8 cone. Of the major changes was increased air patrols over high-risk areas, such as Pacific Islands and Japanese bases, to intercept these bombers before they could complete their missions. Fighter pilots were assigned to intercept the H-8K at high altitude, which required a combination of speed, precision, and maneuverability. Furthermore, pilot training intensified to better prepare them to face this type of aircraft in direct combat. American aviators began to learn to work as a team, forming fighter squadrons that could approach the H-8 from different angles, using group engagement tactics to disorient and neutralize the Japanese bomber. This group cooperation proved crucial, as the ability to bomb accurately required more than a single pilot. A coordinated effort was required to deal with the threat. Another aspect that the Americans began to explore was the use of faster fighter planes with greater high-altitude attack capabilities. Planes like the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and the North American P-51 Mustang were adapted for specific interception missions, with improved weapons and greater maneuverability. These fighters became the primary tools for taking down the H-8K, given that its characteristics made it more difficult to confront the Japanese bomber. Even with these changes, the American pilots knew the battle would not be easy. Each attack on the Kawanishi H-8 posed a considerable risk, and many Allied airmen lost their lives in attempts to destroy this bomber. However, as the months passed and American strategy evolved, victories began to accumulate, and the flying duck became more easily contained. As American pilots sought to adapt to face the Kawanishi H-8K, the impact of this bomber on Japanese military strategies could not be ignored either. The H-8K represented the pinnacle of Japanese long-range bomber engineering, and its introduction into Pacific air operations reinforced the empire of Japan's confidence in its air forces. The bomber not only challenged the Allies in combat, but also served as a symbol of resilience in a protracted war that seemed to have no end. Japan, aware of the strategic importance of H-8K, began to use it increasingly efficiently in its offensives in the Pacific. The bomber was primarily employed in attacks on Allied bases, warships, and military installations on Pacific Islands, where its ability to fly at high altitudes and its resistance to enemy fire provided a decisive advantage. H-8 kit was also used in reconnaissance missions, since its autonomy allowed it to explore large areas without the need for refueling, making it an essential tool for Japan, especially in areas far from its main bases. As the conflict progressed, the Japanese bomber was gradually integrated into a broader strategy aimed at wearing down American forces through continuous and unpredictable attacks. This placed American pilots in a challenging position, as they were not only dealing with the resilience of the H-8K, but also with a war strategy that sought to exploit flaws in the Allied defenses. The impact of H-8 kit was also psychological. American aviators, already overwhelmed by the constant stress of battles in the Pacific, found themselves facing a threat that seemed invincible. This created a climate of uncertainty among the Allied pilots, who needed to find a way to react quickly to avoid losing their H8K more air territory. On the other hand, the Japanese bomber also reflected Japan's desperate attempt to gain a significant advantage in the war, especially after the losses suffered in the early years of the conflict. That H8K was a symbol of this attempted resistance, an effort to regain control and intimidate the Americans. However, as the Allies adapted, the resistance offered by H8K became increasingly difficult to sustain. Despite the impressive resistance of the Kawanishi H8K and the continuing threats it posed throughout World War II, the reality of aerial warfare was rapidly changing. American troop strength in the Pacific was growing, and the Allies were developing new tactics, technologies, and aircraft to deal with the challenges posed by Japanese bombers. In the end, H8K could not escape the advancement of military technology and the more sophisticated strategies that were emerging to defeat it. The decline of Kawanishi H8K began to become visible in the most intense battles of 1945. New American weapons and fighters, such as the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, began to outpace the speed and endurance of the Japanese bomber. These new fighters had greater firepower, superior speed, and were more agile, allowing American pilots to intercept the H8K more effectively. Furthermore, with the advancement of group combat tactics, the bomber became more vulnerable to coordinated maneuvers by Allied fighters. American pilots began to adapt their approaches, creating strategies to minimize the impact of the H8K. One such tactic was the creation of interceptor squadrons that were specifically trained to shoot down this type of bomber. Using faster, more maneuverable fighters, such as THEP-51 Mustang, American aviators were now able to face the H8K more efficiently. From 1945 onward, Japanese bombers began to be shot down more frequently, and Allied air superiority became increasingly evident. Furthermore, the H8K also began to be outclassed by other Japanese aircraft being developed at the time. Japan, although it had created an impressive war machine in terms of design, was unable to keep pace with the Allies' military development. Resource shortages, especially after the bombing of Japan's industrial cities, limited the production of new models. H8K, which were already being replaced by more modern aircraft, but with more limited capabilities. With the improvement of American air capabilities and the weakening of Japanese forces, the Kawanishi H8K lost its relevance in battle. Its use gradually declined, and the air war in the Pacific became dominated by new types of Allied bombers and fighters. Although the Kawanishi H8K, although the Japanese bomber was finally overcome during World War II, its impact on air forces and aircraft design has not been forgotten. The Japanese bomber, with its unique configuration and long-range capability, left a lasting mark on post-war bomber and fighter development. Many of the design elements and lessons learned during the operation of the H8K directly influenced the evolution of military aviation in the post-war period. One of the main legacies of H8K was the idea of long-range bombers. The ability to fly missions over great distances without refueling was an important feature that American military engineers began to incorporate into their own designs. Although the H8K was an extremely resistant aircraft, its range qualities and the efficient use of its bomb load inspired the development of new long-range bombers, such as the B-52 Stratofortress of the United States, which would become one of the most iconic air platforms of the Cold War. Furthermore, the concept of using aircraft with enhanced endurance to withstand combat damage also played an important role in the design of future military aircraft. During the war, H8K demonstrated the ability to withstand considerable damage and remain operational, leading engineers to consider robustness and survivability as crucial characteristics for new fighter jets. This resulted in significant changes in the way the military thought about aircraft construction and endurance. The design of the twin tails of the H8K, which was one of the aspects that initially led to its being called a duck, also influenced later aircraft designs. Although the twin tails of the H8K, while these tails were a quirk, they provided additional stability and helped keep the plane balanced in flight. This type of design, while not common, inspired some engineers to experiment with different tail configurations on bomber and transport aircraft. The H8 kit was also an example of how innovation in aircraft design isn't limited to pretty or conventional aesthetics. It reflected how the need to achieve a strategic objective, in this case, a long-range, high-endurance bomber, can lead to design solutions that deviate from traditional expectations but end up being highly effective on the battlefield. Although the Kawanishi H8K was replaced by new technologies throughout the war, it was part of a larger movement in the evolution of military aviation, contributing to the advances that would shape post-war air forces. In addition to the technical and tactical challenges that the Kawanishi H8K brought to American pilots, the psychological impact was also significant. When Allied aviators encountered this imposing aircraft, many of them were unprepared for the effect it would have on their own mental states. The initial surprise soon turned into an ongoing psychological challenge, as American pilots had to deal with the fear, anxiety, and pressure of facing an aircraft that seemed nearly invulnerable. The H-8K was one of the first truly effective long-range bombers the Americans encountered during the war in the Pacific. The presence of the Kawanishi H-8K over the skies not only posed a threat of devastating attacks, but also caused Allied pilots to question whether they were doing enough to overcome enemy resistance. This created a sense of helplessness among many aviators, who were constantly trying to outmaneuver a seemingly superior adversary that seemed more difficult to shoot down than any other Japanese bomber they had ever faced. The pressure on the pilots was further intensified by the constant combat missions, many of which took place in extreme conditions, with poor visibility and long hours in the air. This situation created significant psychological stress, as the pilots were not only facing each other H-8K, but also to the mental exhaustion of being in constant combat, in unknown territory and not knowing what else might arise. Furthermore, the frustration of not being able to destroy this bomber immediately upon sighting it, or of seeing it escape through difficult maneuvers, affected the pilots' morale. H-8K became, in many ways, a representation of an enemy that refused to yield, something American pilots were not accustomed to facing. For many aviators, the encounter with the H-8K was more than an aerial battle. It was a psychological battle, where each mission was a constant test of their skills and mental toughness. This psychological strain has also led to an increase in cases of combat syndrome among pilots, a post-traumatic stress condition that many face after so many missions, especially those where the H-8K was present. The feeling of constant struggle against a formidable adversary began to affect the aviators' confidence, causing them to question their own survival and combat effectiveness. During World War II, the Kawanishi H8K was primarily used in the Pacific battles, where its range and endurance were put to the test in numerous engagements with Allied forces. Its presence was especially notable in the bombing campaigns against American bases and fleets, where the Japanese bomber demonstrated its exceptional performance. However, its effectiveness in battle varied depending on several factors, including the strategies adopted by the Japanese and the response of American forces. The missions carried out by H-8K were complex and often carried out under intense combat conditions. On some occasions, the Kawanishi H-8K demonstrated an impressive ability to withstand attacks and continue its mission, with American pilots reporting difficulty in shooting it down. The bomber had a robust structure that withstood significant damage, and its ability to fly at high altitudes made it difficult for the most capable Allied fighters to reach. On some missions, H-8K managed to escape in a surprising way, becoming a real headache for the American pilots. However, despite its impressive combat performance, the H-8K was not immune to changing air tactics and the growing superiority of the Allied forces. As the war progressed, American aviators refined their strategies to deal with the threat posed by Japanese bombers. The use of faster and more efficient fighters, such as THEP-51 Mustang, and the adoption of group fighter tactics allowed American pilots to begin to overcome resistance from the H-8K. Still, the presence of the Kawanishi H-8K in the Pacific battles had a considerable impact on American forces. The bomber caused significant damage to several Allied bases and ships, and its presence on the battlefield forced the United States to improve its aerial tactics and capabilities. The psychological impact of the attacks carried out by H-8 cannot be underestimated either, as it forced American pilots to quickly adapt to a new and formidable threat. Ultimately, the performance of the H-8K in the Pacific battles reflects the complexity of aerial combat during World War II, where technological innovation and strategic adaptation by both sides were crucial to success. That H-8K may not have been the definitive aircraft of the war, but its effectiveness in bombing missions and the way it challenged American aviators make it one of the most iconic aircraft in the history of military aviation. The Kawanishi H8K was one of the most notable advances in bomber technology during World War II. Its innovative design and technical capabilities stood out in the context of military aviation at the time. However, like any technology, H8K had its limitations, especially when compared to the more advanced developments that began to emerge during the final years of the war. One of the greatest innovations of H8K was its ability to operate over long distances. This allowed it to carry out strategic bombing missions, striking remote targets without the need for refueling. This made it one of Japan's most effective options, given the vast territory it needed to cover in the Pacific. Its range and endurance were undoubtedly impressive. However, this same range proved to be a double-edged sword, as the bomber depended on forward bases and efficient logistical support to operate in distant locations. Furthermore, the H8K was relatively slow for a fighter plane, which made it vulnerable to faster fighters such as the F-51 Mustang and the F-6F Hellcat. Although the bomber was robust and had good damage resistance, its limited speed made it difficult to escape in combat situations, especially against more agile Allied aircraft. American forces soon realized that by using fighters in coordinated squadrons, they could create a strategic advantage, surrounding the bomber and neutralizing it before it could complete its mission. The H8K also had the disadvantage of relying on a large and experienced crew to operate. Although it was equipped with heavy defensive armaments, such as machine gun turrets, the effectiveness of these defenses depended on the crew's ability to use them in a coordinated and precise manner. This meant that H8K were most vulnerable when facing fighters attacking from multiple angles at once, or when they were caught by surprise without enough time to maneuver and defend themselves adequately. Furthermore, as the war progressed, the Allied forces began to develop aircraft with more advanced bombing capabilities and technical characteristics that surpassed those of the H8K. The B-29 Superfortress, for example, was a bomber that offered greater payload, greater range, and more maneuverability, making it an even greater threat to Japan. The arrival of aircraft like the B-29 and the continued evolution of military aviation on the Allied side marked the end of the era of domination of the H8K. So, although the Kawanishi H8K, although a great engineering feat, its technical limitations began to become apparent as the war neared its conclusion. Its progressive obsolescence in the face of new aircraft and tactics was a reflection of the rapid changes that characterized military technology during World War II. Although the Kawanishi H8K, although it was surpassed by newer innovations during World War II, its impact on military aviation cannot be underestimated. The Japanese bomber left an important legacy, not only for its innovative design but also for the lessons it offered to the Allied military and future generations of aeronautical engineers. The concept of long-range bombers, exemplified by the H8K, was a milestone in military aviation. It demonstrated the importance of combining autonomy with endurance to create an aircraft capable of operating on extended missions and in harsh terrain. This focus on autonomy inspired the development of long-range bombers in the following decades, especially during the Cold War, when the ability to reach distant targets without refueling became even more crucial. B-52 Stratofortress, for example, which became one of the United States' main aircraft during the Cold War, followed the same line of thinking in terms of range and bombing capability. Furthermore, the H8K also had an impact on military strategies of the time. Its presence in the skies over the Pacific forced American pilots to adapt quickly, seeking more coordinated, teamwork-based tactics to combat Japanese bombers. This led to an evolution in aerial combat approaches, with a greater emphasis on the use of fighters and squadrons, where cooperation between pilots became essential to overcome the resistance of aircraft like the H8K. On the other hand, the Japanese bomber also highlighted the limitations of Japan's tactics and technologies at the time. Although the H8K was effective under certain conditions, the lack of resources and the inability to keep up with the pace of technological innovations of the Allies were decisive factors in its obsolescence. The experience with the H8K served as a reminder that in aerial warfare, constant innovation and adaptability are key to ensuring superiority. At the end of the war, the H8K was replaced by more modern and effective aircraft, but it remained a symbol of resilience and adaptability in times of need. Its legacy is not only a reminder of Japanese engineering ingenuity, but also a milestone in the evolution of aerial warfare, where range, endurance, and the ability to survive attacks became essential characteristics for combat aircraft. During World War II, the Kawanishi H8K emerged at a time of great technological innovation in aviation. It was a time of rapid transformation, where new aircraft concepts and combat strategies were constantly being tested and refined. H8 not only represented the pinnacle of Japanese aerial engineering at the time, but was also a reflection of how technology was changing the nature of aerial battles. The H8 kit was designed to be a long-range bomber, capable of operating at distances previously unattainable for many aircraft of the time. Its range of over 3,000 kilometers was a remarkable feat for the technology of the time, making it one of the farthest flying bombers ever manufactured. This ability to fly so far without refueling was extremely valuable to Japan, which needed effective ways to attack Allied bases and fleets scattered across the vast Pacific. However, the H8 kit also reflected the limitations of the technology of the time. While it had impressive features, such as its damage resistance and unique twin-tail configuration, Allied radar and interceptor weapons technology was evolving rapidly. The resilience of its design and ability to absorb damage were remarkable, but the war soon moved into a phase where more sophisticated weapons and tactics began to prevail, such as the use of faster and more powerful fighters, which began to overcome the Allied defenses. H8K. Furthermore, the H8K also exemplified innovation in air defense weapons and tactics. The bomber was equipped with machine gun turrets, which provided effective defense against enemy fighter attacks. These turrets were manned by the crew and offered multi-directional coverage. However, as the war progressed, American fighters began incorporating more powerful armaments, such as larger caliber cannons, which were capable of breaking through enemy defenses. H8K. The impact of H8K in aviation was not limited to Japan or the United States. The aircraft also influenced the air forces of other nations, which observed the technological and tactical innovations being employed. The concept of long-range bombers with great endurance was something that, although eclipsed by other, more modern aircraft, continued to influence the development of bombers and warplanes for decades. On a broader level, the H8 kit was part of a larger shift in military aviation, where emphasis shifted to aircraft with greater range, endurance, and survivability in an increasingly dynamic and unpredictable aerial battlefield. It may have been outclassed during the war, but its design and strategic lessons continued to resonate in the decades that followed. As the war dragged on towards its end, the Kawanishi H8K began to lose its effectiveness as a central combat tool for Japan. Its endurance and bombing capabilities were still formidable, but new technological innovations and the superiority of the Allied forces began to overwhelm the characteristics of the H8K. However, even while the H8K was gradually being overcome, it was part of a larger transition that marked the end of an era of military aircraft and the entry into a new period of aviation. Advances in radar technology, combined with the increasing sophistication of Allied fighters and improved interception tactics, put the H8K in a vulnerable position. American pilots, increasingly experienced and equipped with high-performance fighter planes, such as the F-51 Mustang and the F-6F Hellcat, began to overcome the defenses of the H8K. Their rapid maneuvers and coordinated attacks began to bring down the Japanese bomber more efficiently. Furthermore, Japan faced a shortage of resources during the final years of the war, which made it difficult to produce and maintain aircraft such as the H8K. The lack of materials, fuel, and skilled labor made the operation of the bomber's H8K increasingly difficult. The production of H8K was reduced, and Japan's ability to launch new offensives with the H8K decreased substantially. Meanwhile, the United States continued to develop and improve its own technologies. Faster, more payload capacity bombers, such as the B-29 Superfortress, began to dominate the skies. The B-29 was designed to be faster, with greater autonomy and with better bombing capabilities at high altitudes, surpassing the H8K in all aspects. With the arrival of B-29, the Kawanishi H8K slowly pushed away from the main theater of war. On the battlefield, the superiority of Allied aircraft and the collapse of Japanese resistance in the Pacific signaled the end of the era of H8K. When replaced by more advanced and powerful models, the H8K has become a relic of war, a symbol of Japan's resistance effort, but also a reminder of how technological innovation can quickly transform the landscape of war. Even so, the impact of H8K did not disappear completely. His presence in the Pacific battles left a lasting mark on military aviation, and many of the concepts he introduced influenced the development of future generations of bombers and fighters. H8K may not have been the definitive model, but its contribution to the evolution of military aviation was significant. The Kawanishi H8K, although technologically outclassed, was emblematic of Japanese tactics during World War II. Japan, which lacked the industrial resources of the Allied powers, needed to develop strategies and technologies that would maximize the effectiveness of its armed forces. H8K was undoubtedly a reflection of this need for adaptation and innovation in the face of adversity. Its use in the Pacific battles not only forced the Allies to adapt, but also revealed how much Japan was willing to invest in its resilience, even when the chances of victory became more remote. During the war, the Japanese used the H8K in a series of missions, many of which focused on attacking advanced bases and Allied war fleets. The Japanese bomber was not just a tool for attack, but part of a larger strategy of resistance to the enemy. The airstrikes were a means of putting pressure on American forces, causing significant damage and forcing the Allies to constantly adapt to neutralize the threat posed by H8K. Despite its innovations, Japanese strategy also reflected limitations. Japan lacked the resources necessary to maintain mass production of aircraft. Like the H8K's resources became scarcer, the Japanese struggled to sustain the production and maintenance of their more complex aircraft. Japan, in effect, adopted a strategy of resistance with what it had, while attempting to increase the effectiveness of its long-range aircraft and fighters with available technology. The resistance strategy, symbolized by the use of H8K, was also an attempt to make the most of Japan's limited production and air force capabilities. Even when the war was clearly going in the Allied direction, the H8K and other Japanese aircraft attempted to prolong the conflict by leveraging their tactical advantages, such as surprise attacks and long-range bombing. This strategy reflected one of the most challenging aspects of the war in the Pacific, where the Japanese had to fight a much larger military power with vastly superior resources. However, while the resistance strategy was effective in the short term, it failed to overcome Allied technological advances and air superiority in the long term. H8K, although formidable, was not enough to change the course of the war, and its use towards the end of the conflict was increasingly limited. The Kawanishi H8K may not have changed the course of World War II, but it certainly left a significant legacy in aviation history. Throughout its missions, H8K challenged both American pilots and the engineers of the time, demonstrating that even the most unusual aircraft could be powerful forms of resistance when used intelligently. Its ability to withstand damage and its unique combination of range and endurance made it one of the most impressive aircraft of the period. Although the H8K has been gradually surpassed by more advanced aircraft such as the B-29 Superfortress, it was a milestone in the transition between World War II bomber technologies and the aircraft that dominated the skies in the following decades. The design of the H8K and its technological characteristics directly influenced the development of long-range bombers, many of which are still used in the armed forces of various nations, even today. What the H8 teaches us that innovation in aviation is not limited to pure efficiency or performance. It is also related to adapting to the needs of a given historical moment. Japan, in developing the H8K, was trying to maximize its combat capabilities with the limited resources it had. It was a direct response to the strategic needs of the war in the Pacific, a reflection of how military aviation was shaped by the urgency of the conflict and the need to resist a much more powerful enemy. If you were fascinated by the history of Kawanishi H8K and the impact this aircraft had on World War II, be sure to subscribe to the channel WW2 Pilots. In our next video, we'll explore the fascinating world of large farms and ranches, where the history of World War II pilots meets rural life and the legacy of great cattle empires. Get ready for an epic journey, with surprising stories and interesting facts about the world of ranching. Don't miss it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out. See you in the next video.